January 9th, 1971, Los Angeles, just before noon. The letter was sitting on the kitchen table when Bruce Lee came downstairs. He had been training since 6 in the morning. The backyard, the heavy bag, the specific sequence of movements he returned to every day, not because the sequence was sacred, but because repetition was how you found the thing inside the movement that you could not find any other way. He had showered. He had made coffee. He had come into the kitchen, and Linda was standing near the counter, and the letter was on the table between them, and she was watching him in the particular way she watched him when she already knew something and was waiting to see how he received it. He picked it up. He was 30 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds. He read standing up, the way he often read, not settled into a chair but present in the room, weight balanced, as though some part of him was always ready to move. He read it twice, then he set it down on the table. He picked up his coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where the training equipment was still sitting in the morning light, and said nothing for what Linda would later describe as a long time. The letter was from his contact at the studio. It was not long. It said, in the professional language that the industry used to deliver information it preferred not to frame as a decision, that the project had gone in a different direction, that the lead role had been cast, that they appreciated his contributions to the development process. It did not say who had been cast. He would find that out later. The name, when he heard it, was David Carradine. Let me build this properly, because the letter on the kitchen table is not where this story begins. This story begins years earlier, and the letter is only the last page of something much longer. If I start there without showing you what came before it, the letter looks like a setback. What it actually was is the closing of a door that had been open, or appeared to be open, for long enough that a man of genuine intelligence had allowed himself to believe it might lead somewhere. That belief, the specific contours of it, how it was built, what it was built on, what it cost to hold it, is the story I actually want to tell you. Bruce Lee had arrived in Los Angeles in 1966 with a reputation that existed in a very specific world and was largely invisible outside it. In the martial arts community, and among the people who had seen him at the Long Beach International Karate Championships on August 2, 1964, the demonstration at the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium, the 2-finger push-ups, the 1-inch punch, the footage of which still exists and can be watched by anyone who looks for it. He was already something that required new vocabulary. The physical facts of what he could do were difficult to describe accurately and more difficult to believe without seeing. The speed was the thing people kept returning to. Not fast in the way that trained athletes are fast. Fast in a way that made people check their own perception, that made them look at each other to confirm they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. In Hollywood in 1966, none of that mattered yet. Hollywood in this era had a system for Asian actors that had been in place for decades, that nobody in power had examined carefully enough to question, because examining it would have required acknowledging that it was a choice rather than a natural condition of the industry. The system was this: Asian performers existed in American film and television in supporting functions. They played servants and villains and comic figures and wise men who appeared briefly to deliver ancient wisdom and then disappeared from the narrative. The idea of an Asian man as the lead of an American story, as the person whose survival or destruction drove the emotional machinery of the whole thing, whose face anchored the audience's investment, was not considered a risk. It was considered a category error. Something outside the frame of what American television and film were understood to be for. Bruce Lee had been working inside this system for 4 years by 1970. He had played Kato in The Green Hornet, a role that required genuine physical genius every week, that he had executed at a level that made the lead look like what the lead frequently was, which was a man in a mask standing near someone more interesting. He had done guest appearances. He had taken the meetings. He had driven to the offices in Burbank and the offices in Hollywood proper and the offices in the Valley in a car that needed oil changes he sometimes could not afford. And he had sat across from men in tan jackets and men in suits and men in shirt sleeves, and he had demonstrated repeatedly that the thing he had to offer was unlike anything the industry had seen from anyone. Each time, something stopped. A direction changed. A project went elsewhere. And then, somewhere in the late 1960s, the exact timing is disputed in the accounts, which I'll come to, something appeared to be different. The concept was his. I want to be clear about this, and I also want to be honest with you about the limits of what the historical record can confirm, because those limits matter, and I will not paper over them. What is established in the accounts of people who knew him, who were in rooms with him during this period, who heard him talk about what he was developing? Bruce Lee had been building a concept for a television series centered on a Chinese martial artist navigating the American West. A man trained in a Shaolin tradition, carrying a philosophy and a physical discipline into a country that understood neither, moving through the frontier landscape with a quality of stillness and capability that no Western hero of that era possessed. The concept was not abstract. He had thought through the character, the tone, the way the fights would work, the way the philosophy would function in the narrative, not as decoration, but as the structural logic of how the character moved through every situation he encountered. He had brought this concept into rooms. He had talked about it. He had sat across from development people at studios and networks and described in specific and considered terms what the show could be. Now, here is where I have to be straight with you about what the record can and cannot tell us. The precise sequence of meetings, who said what in which room, exactly how the concept that became Kung Fu traveled from Bruce Lee's articulation of it to a production that bore no credit with his name. This is genuinely contested. The accounts from people who were present agree on the broad architecture. Bruce Lee developed a concept, a series emerged on ABC that was built on that concept. Bruce Lee was not cast in it, and the reason he was not cast was explained to him in terms of commercial viability. The details of how the concept moved and who made which decision at which point are not clean in the historical record. I have spent a long time with this, and I cannot give you a version that is cleaner than the evidence allows, so I will not. What I can tell you is this. By the time the letter arrived on January 9, 1971, the people who knew him best describe a man who believed, with real certainty, that what he had built had been taken from him. And the explanation that had come back in various forms from various rooms was the one the industry always returned to when it needed to explain why an Asian actor could not be the center of an American story. American audiences, they said. American audiences were not ready. I need to tell you something about how I came to this story because it affects how I've read it. When I first started going through the accounts from this period, the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bruce Lee in Los Angeles, the sustained collision between what he was building and what the industry was willing to build with him, my first instinct was anger. Not at any one person or any one decision, but at the accumulated weight of a system operating exactly as it had been designed to operate, producing exactly the outcome it had been designed to produce, with the specific and infuriating efficiency of something that does not need to be intentional to be effective. That anger is legitimate. I want to be clear that I am not going to ask you to set it aside or to find a silver lining that neutralizes it. What happened was what it looks like. A man built something. The system took it, put a different face on it, and told him the audience was not ready for his. But the longer I spent with this story, the more I found something underneath the anger that was harder to name. Something about what he did next that doesn't fit the narrative of a man who was simply wronged and eventually vindicated. something more complicated than that. And it's the complicated thing that I actually want to talk about, because the simple version, wronged man proves them wrong, is true but incomplete, and incomplete truths have a way of flattening the people they're supposed to honor. The letter arrived in January of 1971. The big boss began shooting in March of 1971. Between those two dates, approximately 8 weeks, possibly less, something happened in Bruce Lee that is not fully documented and that I cannot reconstruct with precision. What I can tell you is what the people around him observed. A man who was not broken by what had happened, but who was different afterward. Not visibly different in any dramatic way. Not the kind of different that announces itself. The quieter kind. The kind that shows up in decisions rather than in behavior. He made a decision to go to Hong Kong. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Going to Hong Kong in 1971 meant accepting, at least provisionally, that the project he had been building toward in America, the specific goal of making American audiences see what he knew he could show them on American screens through the American industry's distribution infrastructure, was not going to be built the way he had planned it. It meant operating in an industry that was in an entirely different relationship with his presence than Hollywood had been. It meant starting over, in some sense, while also carrying everything he had built through the years of meetings and waiting rooms and letters on kitchen tables. The early 1970s were a period of real upheaval in Hong Kong cinema. Golden Harvest Studios had only recently broken from the Shaw Brothers system, the monopoly that had controlled Hong Kong film production for decades, and was operating as a genuine independent studio with the hunger and infrastructure that independence created. The industry had both the commercial appetite and the creative space for something new. Bruce Lee arrived at the precise moment when those conditions were right. Whether he understood that fully when he made the decision to go, or whether he understood it only in retrospect, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is what happened when he got there. The big boss shot between March and May of 1971 in Pak Chong, Thailand, with exterior locations in conditions that the crew would describe for years afterward. The heat that arrived early and stayed, a different texture from the Hong Kong heat that most of them knew, heavier in some hours and drier in others, requiring constant management and constant adjustment. The ring canvas at the outdoor Thai fighting venues had the smell of old work, tiger balm and sweat, and something underneath both that was the smell of a surface where physical confrontation had happened many times before. The exterior locations were real working environments, real places where real labor happened, and the physical reality of those environments came through in what ended up on film. He was 30 years old. He had been practicing martial arts since he was 13. He had been building, absorbing from every source that offered anything useful and discarding whatever did not survive contact with reality, assembling something that was entirely his own out of materials that had begun somewhere else for 17 years. On set in Thailand, the local fighters and stunt performers who worked alongside him experienced what everyone who worked alongside him in a physical context experienced, something that their existing frameworks were not fully equipped to process. The speed was the thing they kept returning to, the way everyone always kept returning to the speed, because it was the thing that most clearly exceeded what their training had prepared them to expect from any human being. The film was released on October 31st, 1971, in Hong Kong. Within a week, the box office numbers had made the previous conversation impossible to continue having in the same terms. The records the film broke were not marginal records. They were the kind of numbers that require an industry to go back to the beginning of its assumptions and examine them. He had done one thing over and over, until he could do it better than anyone had ever done it, not 10,000 different things. The same thing, refined past the point where refinement was visible from the outside, past the point where what you were seeing was practice, and into the territory where what you were seeing was simply the person. The audience that Hollywood had told him was not ready. The audience that could not follow a Chinese lead, whose commercial behavior had been predicted with the confidence of people who had decided not to consult it, had come in numbers that nobody in any office in Los Angeles had predicted, had kept coming. Fist of Fury shot in the final months of 1971, October through December approximately, at Golden Harvest Studios in Kowloon on Hammer Hill Road, in the concrete block buildings that housed the multiple sound stages where Hong Kong cinema was being made at that moment. The studio air was always a mixture of things, the Cantonese and English that moved between them mid-sentence, sometimes mid-word, in the specific hybrid that production environments develop when they are working across two languages simultaneously. The heat from the studio lighting that added to whatever ambient temperature Kowloon was contributing. The harbor smell that came in through any exterior door, salt and diesel and the trace of the fishing industry that was always somewhere to the south. Dim sum carts at midday. The particular density of a production environment that was operating at full capacity. Fist of Fury was released March 22, 1972. Another record. Here is where I want to ask you something, and I want to be specific about what I'm asking, because I've been sitting with this particular question for longer than almost any other aspect of this story, and I still have not resolved it. The letter on the kitchen table in January of 1971 said, in its professional and carefully constructed language, that the project had gone in a different direction. By March of 1972, 14 months later, the direction Bruce Lee had gone in instead had produced two of the most commercially significant films in the history of Hong Kong cinema. The audiences who were supposed to not be ready had been ready all along. The assumption that had been used to explain why he couldn't be at the center of the story turned out to be false in the only way that matters commercially, which is numerically and publicly. What I keep returning to is this. The people who sent that letter, the development executives, the network people, the man or men who made the decision, never had to reckon with being wrong in any direct or personal way. The industry absorbed the information from Hong Kong and adjusted its behavior toward Bruce Lee, and Enter the Dragon went into production in January of 1973 with Warner Brothers cameras in Golden Harvest Studios, and all of that is true. But the specific individuals who decided that American audiences were not ready for a Chinese lead were never required to sit in a room and account for that decision in light of what the Hong Kong box office had demonstrated about the accuracy of their reasoning. I find I have two responses to this, and I cannot reconcile them. One response is that this is simply how industries work. Decisions are made, the market responds, the market is wrong or right, and the individuals who made the decisions move on to other decisions. The other response is that something is missing from that accounting, that the absence of any direct reckoning is itself a fact about how those systems operated. I want to know how you sit with this, not the whole story, this specific part, the gap between what was decided and what the evidence showed, and whether anyone was ever required to close that gap. Leave it in the comments. I mean it. Way of the Dragon shot in August and September of 1972. Rome first, the Colosseum area in the early morning hours before the heat arrived and before the tourists arrived. The stone pale gold and quiet, in a way that the rest of Rome never quite was. The sound of Italian motor scooters audible from the streets beyond the perimeter. The espresso cart making its circuit twice daily. The Italian crew and the Hong Kong crew, finding the working rhythm of a production that was operating across 3 languages and 2 filmmaking traditions simultaneously. He wrote this film. He directed it. He performed in it. Every decision that shaped the finished thing passed through him. The concept of a television series built around a Chinese martial artist navigating an American landscape, which had been developed and then given to someone else to execute, that concept was, in this film, finally being made by the person who had conceived it. Not in the form it was supposed to take. Not in America. Not on a television screen. Not through the industry that had looked at it and decided it required a different face. In Rome, in Hong Kong, on film, entirely on his own terms. The film was released December 30th, 1972. Enter the Dragon went into production in January of 1973. Warner Brothers and Golden Harvest Studios on Hammer Hill Road. The American studio finally in the building that Hong Kong cinema had built, because the numbers from 1971 and 1972 had made the choice to stay away commercially indefensible. He had not gone back to the room that had sent him the letter. The room had come to him. Crossed 6,000 miles to be in the same building with what he had built and to attach its name to it. He died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon was released on August 19th, 1973. The audience that had never been ready came in enormous numbers and kept coming. He did not see it. The letter on the kitchen table. This is what I keep returning to. Not the box office records, not the trajectory of the career, not the eventual vindication. The letter on the kitchen table on the morning of January 9th, 1971. And the long moment Bruce Lee stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard where his training equipment was sitting in the morning light. What was he thinking in that moment? I do not know. Linda has spoken about this period in general terms. The sustained difficulty, the frustration, the specific quality of a man who processed hard things internally before he ever brought them into speech. She has described him as someone who, in the face of the hardest things, went to work. Who found, in training and in writing and in the continuous refinement of what he was building, the thing that other people might have found in conversation or in grief or in the various other ways that people manage the weight of having believed something and found out it was not going to be. He went to the backyard. He trained. He wrote. The concept that had been taken from him and placed at the center of an American television series would be seen by American audiences in the form the network had decided American audiences needed, with the Chinese monk at the center played by a white actor, with the accent of the Chinese-American experience replaced by something more palatable, with the specific human being who had built the concept quietly removed from his own creation. And the concept as he had actually envisioned it, the Chinese man moving through a world that did not understand him, carrying his philosophy and his physical knowledge as the only tools he needed, encountering every obstacle from a position of absolute internal stillness. That concept he took to Hong Kong and made himself. In a different medium, in a different language, for a different audience that turned out to be enormous and global and entirely ready. The goal, he understood, was not always meant to be the destination. Sometimes it was the thing that pointed you somewhere. The series that was supposed to be his had pointed him toward something larger than a series, toward the complete creative control of a filmmaker who wrote and directed and performed within a single unified vision, toward a commercial record that made him impossible to refuse, toward the Warner Brothers cameras that came to him rather than the other way around. The letter on the kitchen table had said the project went in a different direction. It had been right. It had gone in his direction. It had just taken a route that nobody in that office had anticipated or intended, and the destination it arrived at. Enter the Dragon, Golden Harvest Studios, January 1973, the first major Hollywood-Hong Kong co-production, was further from where the letter started than any of the people who signed it had been capable of imagining on a January morning in 1971. He set down the letter. He stood at the window. Then he went back outside and he trained.